Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone to this, I believe, what is it, the fourth session now from the CLI series, conference series on transformation literacy. This week is the session about metrics. So it's all about the influence they have on our efforts for transformative change and to follow up on the big question on what gets measured, gets improved, but also the who and the how and when and all its effects on whether we get inspired to engage and come together in collective efforts. So welcome to all of you from wherever you're signing in. Feel free to share your name and where you're coming from in the chat so we see a little bit who is here and who is listening in. I'm Elizabeth Kuhn, a managing partner at the Collective Leadership Institute, and I'm very happy to be one of the facilitators and hosts today for this session. Just briefly a word about the Collective Leadership Institute itself. We are an international non-profit organization, and we're based in Germany, in South Africa, and also in Egypt and in the US. And our passion is really to empower people across the world to develop their individual and their collective skills for transformation literacy so that we can all come together for the many collective efforts that are necessary to really bring us on a path for our sustainable future, or for a sustainable future. And I think the most recent developments and news have really shown us once again that such collective endeavors are really what our future needs. So in this session this week, in the first part of it, we will explore a little bit the importance of metrics for, let's say, large-scale sustainability efforts. So namely the role of the GDP and also when it comes to the private sector environmental indicators. And in the second part, we will look a little bit closer at metrics, not only for our progress in transformative change, but also metrics on the quality of how we actually work together, and see how these two are often very closely connected. All right, and with that, I would actually like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Petra Kuenkel, who is not only the founder and the executive director of the Collective Leadership Institute, but also a true visionary when it comes to providing guiding points and in no matter what endeavor that always resonate with our humanity. So I'd like to pass it to you, Petra.
Thanks. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for introducing us. And I would like to say something about transformation literacy. You've mentioned the point that more than ever at the moment at this stage in history regarding the terrible war that is happening, or the many terrible wars that are happening, and regarding climate change, we need to actually all become transformation literate. And I think it needs to be clear that this is a skill that we need at all levels. We need it for all societal sectors, for the private sector, for the public sector, and for civil societies, but we also need it at all levels. So we need to look at how do we move together towards transformations in various scales and in various different forms. So that is at the core of this conference. You know, what is transformation literacy? And we so often think about transformation literacy as something that only comes from politics and governments, but no, the actual happening of transformation literacy takes place everywhere at different levels. And I always say it's our job, all of our, the job of all of us. So if we look at metrics, I would like to remind us that if we think about metrics, we think about figures. And I would say, yeah, that's right. So we also, I'll look at metrics as something quantitative, but I would like to kind of remind us that metrics can also be something qualitative, and still, you know, that can result in figures. And we will see this in the second part. And in the first part, when we look at metrics, I would like to remind us that actually metrics are very strongly related to our collective consciousness, to our ability to perceive things. Because if we go back to what metrics are, we may perceive them actually only as figures, but they are a way of looking at things and a way of jointly looking at things. And they also most often contain some kind of agreement how we look on things. So the purpose of metrics is so extremely important. I mean, you sometimes forget about it, that it's so much linked to our collective ability to make sense of things. So in that way, I think it is extremely important to look at metrics as something that really supports our joint endeavor towards transformation. And you all know that this is the year, or maybe most of you know, this is the year where the famous report to the Club of Rome, Limits to Growth, is actually 50 years old. So I don't know, those of you who know the report, Limits to Growth, it is a report where that actually said, you know, we need to change the way we behave on our planet in order to survive on our planet. So I cut a long story short, but what I would like to highlight is that if we remember that one of the authors was Donella Meadows, who unfortunately passed away much too early. And Donella Meadows, and I would like to read this out to you in terms of metrics, because I think it is such a good reminder. Donella Meadows in this report said, condition number one for the future is renewable resources should be used not faster than they can regenerate. Makes total sense. Second condition for the future is pollution and waste should not be put into the environment faster than the environment can recycle them or render them harmless. Sounds simple. Condition number three is non-renewable resources shall not be used at all, or renewable substitutes should be developed. And condition number four is the human population and the physical capital plant, so you know, also the structures that we build, needs to be kept at a level low enough to allow for the three first conditions to happen. And number five, and that is really important also today, is that these previous four conditions need to be met through processes that are democratic and equitable enough so that people can really stand for them. And I think this is a good reminder because it sounds so incredibly simple and so incredibly logic that we ignore it all the time. Or I would say we may not ignore it all the time, but we ignore it at scale. And what this also makes clear that what Donella Meadows said is we need to find measurements and metrics for these conditions that help us, as I said before, into a collective sense making, into our ability to make sense of a situation collectively. So that obviously also means that there must be agreement on certain metrics. And this gets us into the first conversation with Rutger Hoekstra, welcome, and Melanie Wilneder. And I would like to introduce the two a little bit, and then I hope we are going to get into I hope a very exciting conversation. So let's start with Rutger. Rutger, you are somebody I know who has been passionate about replacing GDP as an index or as a measurement. And you're not the only one. I think there's a lot of criticism on GDP, and I think you're quoting Robert Kennedy, and many people do that. And I remember, if I remember this right, it was already in the 60s that he said, you know, we are measuring always the wrong thing, and that what we really value we don't really measure. So that is quite an interesting point, because you have been also trying to write about the importance of replacing GDP. You have been writing about, and that is evenly challenging, about the many different sustainability metrics that have developed in the last almost want to say 50 years, because you know the start of developing sustainability metrics was pretty early after the Limits to Growth report. And you've been working on that for quite a while, and I believe also with some kind of frustration that there are too many things that are underlined and that not harmonized. But so you bring in a lot of experience in that. So what would you say with your experience? How do you see the current state? Where are we on a scale between one, no we are still completely, I would say, addicted to GDP as a global society. And we are very far away from having metrics and indicators that really show us transformation to sustainability. Or 10, yeah, we're getting very, very close and we are on the right path. Rutger, where are we?
So I think I've been studying this for 15 years or so, and there will have been periods that I would have answered a 3, and there are periods that I would have answered a 9. Sometimes you're very optimistic and you see hopeful signs. Sometimes you're a bit more pessimistic. I'm actually a bit optimistic today. So let's say 7 or 8 on a scale of 1 to 10. Short answer, right?
This is a short, good answer. So you would say there's hope. You see that
yeah, I see hopeful signs. Yeah.
Getting together and really doing their job in bringing, so we're going to go there a little bit more into detail. You know, what do we actually need? You know, do we need a complexity of indicators, or do we need kind of one index? You know, we're going to get there. So Melanie, welcome to our panel. Melanie, you have made quite a journey from, we know each other from, it's almost 10 years ago.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I hope I remember this right, but I remember we had a conversation, you know, where you said for good reasons you left the private sector, or at least you left a what would have been a super career in a consultancy company. Because you said, no, I just can't go there. And you joined the Carbon Disclosure Project, you know, which was then also busy in finding metrics, you know, that could really help people, or I would say even pressure companies a little bit, you know, to disclose, you know, their carbon situation, etc. But then you have moved back to the private sector, and you're not actually consulting. You're consulting companies, you know, on I would say environmental sustainability metrics. So in your experience, because you do have long-standing experience now in the field, you know, the international discussion on it, but you also know the concrete things and the concrete, let's say, hurdles, you know, that you face in consulting, or that companies face in implementing indicators. Where are we, again, on a scale between 0 and 10, between Europe and Latin America? Where are we? Are we getting the right direction, or going back?
Yes, like a good consultant, I will give you a little bit of a matrix. So there's reporting and having indicators. I would say we're definitely around an 8 when it comes to corporates' own emissions. We are a bit further behind, maybe a 4 or 5 when it comes to engaging your value chain. That's just harder, but that's only reporting. In terms of acting, because you rightly said, Petra, at the beginning, we need to act. In terms of using the KPIs to act, we're still a bit further behind. So there, I would say maybe a 6 for own corporate emissions and close to 0 on supply chain. Okay, maybe a 2. I don't want to be so negative, but there's, you know, reporting, and there's using the KPIs to act, and then there's a difference between companies measuring very well what they are responsible for within their own boundaries and their own factories, and then engaging with the value chain, which is simply harder.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So you would say what we need to learn is that the reporting is one thing, but the actually making the metrics a basis for decision making is another thing. You know, like getting companies to action on the base of setting targets that are different. Am I getting this right? Yes,
because it is fairly easy mathematically to calculate and take a carbon budget and say the planet can burn this much carbon, and for companies to reverse engineer what it means for them and how much they can still burn. So to set a carbon reduction target based on that, but when companies then look at how to actually decarbonize, the effort required, the level of technology maturity, that's where it becomes difficult. But companies are increasingly at least making those calculations, and then they are able to get a sense of the magnitude of the challenge ahead.
And the challenge is a big challenge, I guess. Let me go back to Rutger first, and go back to the story of GDP. And yeah, I think as long as I could remember any kind of engagement on sustainability, people are criticizing GDP. Why is it still the prominent thing that we hear in the news? every, I don't know, couple of days, a new every year, you know, it's like that thing, you know, that seems to be saying everything about the performance of a society.
Yeah, I've went through various phases of thinking about this, and I guess sometimes the narrative that you will hear is, you know, kind of a polemic between economists. So the economists, they're kind of dominant and ruling the world, and in companies you'll have, you know, the CFO and the CEO only caring about money, so to speak. And I think to a certain extent it's really useful to think of it in that way, because it is kind of a power dynamic between various ideas in the world. At the same time, when we do consider those power dynamics, it's also good to try and understand why perhaps the power of the beyond GDP movement is perhaps not as good as it should be. So we are up against a very powerful metric, but also a very powerful profession of economists, and you can criticize them, but you could perhaps also look at the sources of their power, so to speak. How did they manage to capture the imagination and the literacy, really, of society after the Second World War? And that's what I've become increasingly interested in.
And what's your guess? What's your guess? Why are people so addicted to this measurement?
Well, three things I'd like to point out. First is, I do think that we need to look at the coherence of our own community. So economists have this figure all over the world, which is a logistical feat of huge proportions, right? To have 200 countries publish the same number every quarter is a fabulous achievement if you're just looking at it from a logistical sense. I mean, that is really something to do that. And if you look at the beyond GDP community, we have hundreds of systems produced by dozens of academics, institutes, NGOs with different names, different terminology, just totally spread out. So coherence-wise, I think we could criticize economists, but we could also criticize our own community in the sense of, are we really projecting some kind of message with this? That's the first thing, and we could perhaps in the discussion go further into that. Second thing is, I think sometimes the metrics do not focus enough on humans. I think humans to relate to certain metrics, it's also very important to understand what it means for them, so to speak. And sometimes I get the feeling that a lot of metrics have to do with systems. So the economy is a system, nature is a system, technology is a system. But I think also people really have the desire to understand what it means for their lives, for their their working lives, their daily lives, their health, their education. So I also think we need to be an additional effort to really bring it to life, what it means for people. And the third dimension is something that was also said earlier, is by Melanie, is that we don't just need retrospective statistics about what happened in the past with well-being, sustainability, and equity. We also need models and decision-making tools about the future. So economists, an economist can tell a policymaker, you know, GDP was pretty awful last year. And then the policymaker will ask, well, what can I do about that? And then they'll say, well, according to my CGE model, you should stimulate this or you should do that. And we do too little actually of the actual decision-making tools. So coherence, more human-based metrics, and policy, I think are three of the aspects that I covered also in my book.
Great, great, Rutger. That is, so learning is that actually the sustainability community needs to have a more, let's say, harmonized approach. We find this also in, for example, in standards. You know, that's a huge challenge.
Yeah, exactly.
Too many standards, and a benchmark or harmonization is actually important because that is a very powerful move. Melanie, if I move to you and say, does it ring a bell what Rutger is saying in terms of there is pretty much a chaos of different things, and people don't know what to use, and people would like to have, particularly in companies, that would have one dashboard, saying everything. So how would you respond to that? Is there a similar challenge for metrics for companies?
Yes, so I think the key is for every company to first do a materiality assessment. And one needs to bear in mind that depending on the industry sector, and even within industry sectors, priorities will be a bit different. So to look at two very simple indicators, carbon and water, I think those are two environmental indicators we can relate to easily. It could be that if you are a producer, let's say you're Apple, production, or you are a factory that produces for Apple. So that could be carbon intensive because you need energy to produce the phones. So carbon is a hotspot and you should have carbon metrics. Water in your factory, maybe not, but when you then also do the materiality assessment for your supply chain, the semiconductors and pieces that go into the phone you're building, that's very water intensive. So you need to engage with your suppliers on their water management, whereas let's say it's less energy intensive. So everybody has to pick their hotspots. You have to be able to illustrate why certain things are material for you versus your supply chain to justify this is what we're prioritizing. Also, every few years, re-evaluating what's not material, because this can change as your business changes, and ensure that you track the right metrics at the right level. So in my very simple example, carbon in your own operations and water with your suppliers.
So Melanie, would you say it's good that there is a choice of different metrics in different areas, where you say, if I understand this right, that a company needs to be able to choose from a set of indicators because the situation might be different. And then the company needs to actually adjust and say, I need, I'll focus on these and these and these indicators because they are most relevant for my context. So would you say it's actually positive that there is a set of indicators that might be looking complex at the beginning?
If you are fully transparent, yes. For instance, there are companies that have no own manufacturing whatsoever, and they will report on their own numbers and they will say, we're great. But actually, if you don't look at your supply chain, somebody will say, well, yes, you are great, but you're not reporting about your supply chain and you have a huge environmental impact there. So as long as there's this transparency driven by honesty to say, okay, we have these impacts or we don't, you can't simply displace your environmental impact and not report about it. I think that's my point. Absolutely.
So let me go back to Rutger and say, Melanie was speaking about there needs to be a contextualization, of indicators. But of course, it needs to be these need to be valid indicators. It's not that every company kind of would invent, their own metrics. I mean, like that might also be happening, but that there needs to be a certain validity and a certain credibility. So if you take this back to the community around sustainability indicators, is there also a need to say, what sustainability indicators are, or what sustainability is, or what in your case, you're part of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, what well-being is, needs to be defined in every context in a different way, on the country level or even on the local level, and would this justify a complexity of indicators, or do you see a different direction where there certain indicators have a certain validity, and could you give us examples for that?
Yeah, I sometimes get, if you're looking at the measurement of the economy, there's actually also a lot of context in there, right? Economies around the world are actually not all the same. There are economies that are very much focused on mining or agriculture or service sector or government. So even if you really look closely at the measurement system for the economy, sometimes we have the impression that this is a standardized system, but actually in reality, economies are very different. And the way that national statistical offices fill it in, for example, could be sometimes quite different. And I think that's also the case for well-being, sustainability and equity. I think those are the three dimensions. So well-being is one aspect. How are the people doing what is the quality of their lives at this moment. Inclusion, equity is how is well-being distributed within the current population, and that has a dimension within a country and between countries. And then the third dimension is, of course, sustainability. So well-being, inclusion, and sustainability. If you look at the literature really from a very broad lens, basically all of the beyond GDP literature falls into 1, 2, or 3 of those domains. And then if you ask the question, well, can you measure well-being, for example? The answer is, of course, no. Well-being is such a large philosophical question. It's a phenomenon that we can't even define for ourselves. So any measurement really is an abstraction of something that we that is far greater, I think, than ourselves. At the same time, it is the case that various scientific fields have attempted to measure this rather large philosophical notion. And so you'll have economists with welfare economics, you'll have the capability approach of Sen, Kahneman has done work, there is subjective well-being measurements. And I think each of these measures give us some notion of that rather large philosophical concept without having the pretense of there being a perfect measure of well-being, for example. And the same goes for sustainability, where there are planetary boundaries, ecological footprints, inclusive wealth measures. There are many different ways of measuring it. I don't believe ever in a perfect index, but I actually believe that combined all this information gives us the best opportunity to really see what is right in the world and what is wrong in the world.
So I'm going to come back to that, Rutger, and ask you a little bit, looking into the future. But first of all, I would like to ask Melanie, in terms of what are companies taking up, that you can see that they're more easily taking up in terms of indicators. For example, Rutger has mentioned the planetary boundaries, and now surprisingly it is a very abstract term. And if you look at the graph that some people may know, then you think, oh, how on earth can we ever measure what's on there? It seems to be absolutely impossible. Yet as a narrative, it has really landed, for maybe good reasons, and people have distributed it, and also because it is such a concept that people, kind of probably suddenly get frightened about and say, oh, like there are boundaries and we shouldn't transgress boundaries. If you look at companies, do they refer to planetary boundaries? Do they rather refer to sustainability, or do they have kind of more a narrow view and say, this is just, kind of our indicators are just this and this and that, and we don't know this abstract things.
Very good question. Sustainability managers are increasingly being trained on planetary boundaries. I attended a course myself a few years ago in London before I moved to Chile. So there is that awareness, but the way sustainability managers are then translating this into the corporate agenda, in particular with FMCG companies and companies that somewhere in their supply chain consume natural resources, they're talking about being regenerative companies. Walmart is one example leading this, and you might not necessarily associate them with this. They are better than they get given credit in the public. So Walmart and other companies are looking at being a regenerative company in the sense that for every acre or hectare of land that they use through their supply chain, so let's say a hectare where cows are grazing, or every cubic meter of water that they consume, again, including their value chain, they want to restore the equivalent amount. So that makes sense, taking the planetary boundaries, because of the type of value chains they have, because they sell products that are either from nature in terms of anything derived from grains and agriculture, or also even when it is meat, referring back to the land and the grazing, and fish also referring to the ocean. So that is one way they implement it at a quantitative level. It is obviously difficult for them to quantify, because one thing is measuring your carbon footprint, and another thing is measuring water use at particular factory sites. When you then really look at your entire value chain, whether you're Walmart or a smaller company or Unilever, and you really have to think and extrapolate in the best form possible, how many cubic meters of water did I as a company consume, or how much did we pollute through a very complex value chain where suppliers might not be well equipped to report? How do we estimate that correctly? And how do you in practice really restore that, right? At a metrics level, you can say, I estimate this. These are the issues with my measurement that I acknowledge. I try to get better in my measurement. And then what do? I buy this land equivalent and I restore it, or I invest into this watershed. So it is difficult, but it has been a huge development from planetary boundaries at an intellectual level, discussed in more academic circles, to having CEOs of their own internal and ESG conferences speak about being regenerative companies. And I think in the case of Walmart, there are actually some videos available on YouTube where it's the CEO talking about regeneration. And then you can, of course, poke holes, but it is a huge step up from 10 years ago.
So would you say, Melanie, that this is an example where metrics, even though they might be quite, let's say, abstract, yeah, so but that the fact that the planetary boundaries are seen as metrics, I mean, like, although we know it's difficult to put numbers, to each of them, we do have it in climate change. We have a number, kind of that's also globally agreed, although it's not yet fully agreed, that we need to reduce or kind of not transgress, 1.5 or 2 degrees. But would you say that that is an example where a metrics discussion actually leads to new narratives that then lead to different decision making?
Definitely.
Yes,
definitely, because they're taking responsibility for something that before was externalized. And you can look at carbon taxes, which are increasingly being applied across countries, to the point that companies that fear a carbon tax are implementing their own carbon price. But that is still a very abstract internal financial metric. Then there are questions when there is a carbon price rate, a carbon tax raised by a government. What does the government do with those funds? Does the government really invest them into renewable energy, for instance, as they often claim? Or when you talk about being a regenerative company, when you take your own responsibility in absence of a law that charges you a price on carbon, where you say, I'm calculating this, might not be perfect, but then you actually put the money on the table and you engage with stakeholders all the way down the value chain, and you are restoring nature.
Yeah,
that's so definitely a shift.
So that would be part of really getting it into the strategy. So
yes,
yeah, okay. So Rutger, there was a question in the chat saying, isn't it possible to extend the term well-being to well-being for all, and all means all species, not only human beings? And would you say the concept of well-being indicators, because there are some, maybe you can talk about them, would include the planet as a whole, or does it only include human beings?
No, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that actually well-being has to go for all species on our planet. It is quite difficult, of course, just from a measurement perspective, just to think of what that means. At the same time, I do want to, the second point I made was that I do think if we're thinking about how can we translate these metrics to a global audience, I do think a lot of people are very curious about what does this transformation mean for their lives, and in 2050, what will our lives look like? How many hours will we be working? What will our transportation look like? What will and I think sometimes we forget that also, perhaps with a question like this. I do think if we really want to have an envisioning of this transformation, it is also very important to think about it from those well-being terms. Keynes, one of the most famous economists from the last century, he in 1930, he was envisioning what would his grandchildren's life look like in 2030. And there actually, he was an economist, but he wasn't thinking about goods and services and production. He was actually thinking in hours. So he actually predicted, I think, that his grandchildren would only be working 11 or 15 hours because the productivity growth would be so great that you could actually earn your money just in 11 hours. And the rest of your time you would be spent reading poetry and going to the ballet, because Keynes was very fond of ballet. But that does show you.
It didn't come true, Rutger.
It didn't come true, but it's still important. I think it's very important that we give, with these metrics, we also indicate what life will look like in this new. We need to change a lot of things in our lives to get to this sustainable future. And I think we need to make an additional effort to really bring home what exactly will that life look like, and what are we asking of people themselves. And sometimes I believe our community is too focused on the systems and system dynamics, and it's very important, of course, but I think we also need to make the extra effort to relate it to ourselves and to humans at some stage, to really make it engaging for people.
So there's an interesting point that I would like to bring up. This means that the actually relationship between us as people, because you remember in the beginning I said metrics. We need to remember that metrics are a means for us to understand the world better. And understand. So we all make some kind of sense of the world, and metrics are something a little bit more externalized and a little bit more agreed upon with others. But then if they take life on their own, and GDP definitely has taken on a life on its own,
Absolutely.
They actually start govern us. So we need to kind of also redefine this relationship between us and metrics. And on the other hand, and I'm teasing you a little bit, provoking you a little bit, you said, in the statistical offices around the world, they put the figure together every 3 months. And actually they need to put a different figure together, or different figures together. So what would create that shift, that in the bureaucracy of our statistical offices, it's absolutely clear, no, we don't put this figure together, no, but we will put a figure together that is attached to a narrative of the future, that is life-oriented, that is thriving, that is a narrative where the world is a different place. What needs to happen to push this into the statistical offices?
I would say, again, the history of economics tells us a lot. From 1948, this quarterly GDP was being published in the United States. So every quarter, there's a press release of GDP figures. And what's really interesting is that I also have research on the New York Times archives. So they have 100 years of New York Times archives. And you'll actually find that during the Great Depression, which was the worst economic period in history of the 19th century or 20th century, the amount of articles that had the word economy in them was only 3%. 3% of the articles during the worst economic crisis of that century, only 3% of articles had the word economy in them. Fast forward to the COVID pandemic now, and 1/6 of all articles in the New York Times have the word economy in them. So we are constantly being triggered with the word economy. So it's a psychological conditioning, basically, and statistical offices is basically free subsidized marketing of the word economy.
That's interesting.
If you look at it from that perspective, what would happen if we had a harmonized system of measurement all over the world, and every quarter there was a press release by 200 statistical offices where the foundation was well-being, there was a well-being indexes, there were sustainability indexes, and there were inclusivity indexes. I believe that if there was harmonization of terminology and those kind of things, actually what would happen is then the press and the media would get also would pick up these things, and you would actually see that these terms should be used more often. And to relate it to what you said earlier, Petra, you said there should be some kind of transformational literature or transition literacy. I think that's actually what economists did. They brought economic literacy not just to the economists, but also to the media and to society. So we all understand the economy at some level. And when you're talking about transformational literacy, I think we do need to be more clear what exactly are those, and we need triggers in the media and in our conversations that actually help us to perpetuate this literacy towards one another.
That's quite interesting. So we actually need to maybe reduce the number of terms on economy and bring up the number of terms of a future that we actually want. So you can also relate to, because the economy seems to be something somewhere different, not really related to our hearts.
One of my more controversial things is that I try and avoid using the word economy as much as possible. And I find it sometimes a bit irritating that we have terms like well-being economy, donut economy, steady state economy. If you want to replace something, but you still need to use that term all the time, then you are to a certain extent perpetuating the narrative that the economic system, that's the system we need to focus on, we just need to change it. But actually the planet is the foundation and society is the foundation. So I generally, when I say things like this, I call it, the well-being, inclusion and sustainability planet, but not the economy. It shouldn't be the economy that we keep on focusing on.
That's a very interesting point. I remember Jane Jacobs. I don't know, she was an architect and a city, I would say, systems scientist in the United States, long back, a couple of decades ago. And she had a wonderful book where she said, we should talk about economy, we should talk about bionomy, because it's not about the household that we need to manage, because it's just not looking far enough, but we need to look at managing life. I mean, managing not in terms of managing and controlling, but I would say in terms of stewarding life. But we need to completely shift our role. So Melanie, maybe last intervention from you is we've been talking now about narratives and metrics, and metrics sometimes taking on a life of their own. And you also said, that some discourses about metrics, like around the planetary boundaries, have really made a difference, to the strategy. So is there something similar to what I asked Rutger? How can we get the statistical bureaus, to actually bring out different figures? Is there something similar in companies where you say this is a shift that actually needs to happen or is already happening, in terms of when the narratives shift, then also the metrics shift, or when there are the right metrics, then it contributes to shifting narratives and shifting strategies?
I think there are two sets of metrics, and the easier one in terms of understanding and methodologically is how you measure things like carbon, water, deforestation. There are standards for that, and you can refer to those standards just to keep it simple, because I'm guessing one of the reasons we seem to be unable to get away from GDP is because it is just one number and everybody wants simple numbers. So a carbon footprint or liters of water, that can be simple, but then the other metrics that have resulted from the measurement, the target setting metrics, those are still the ones where I think in environmental sustainability, we have a lot of work to do. So for instance, let's say you set a target to be carbon neutral, carbon positive, carbon negative. Nobody understands. Journalists certainly don't understand. And then in the media, you will have the same publication, one person writing about one company or one country talking about carbon neutrality, another one talking about carbon positivity. It turns out they mean the same thing, but one writer, author, who doesn't have a frame of reference thinks carbon positive just sounds better. From a scientific mindset, you would say this is about reducing and drawing down on emissions. Scientifically, it's better to use the word carbon negative. And then a third person might come in there and say, wait, this carbon negativity or positivity or whatever, what is it referring to? What has been measured? oh, this company is measuring emissions correctly, because as I said in the beginning, you can measure correctly, you know how to measure. They haven't declared everything. So this target is worth less because they haven't disclosed 100% of their emissions, right? So I think target setting metrics certainly have to evolve, and for companies to make the necessary shift in their mentality, because I have been reading the comments that all of you have been leaving, companies need to stop externalizing their environmental impact, and whether we like the financial approach or the market-based approach or not, because of where companies are and meeting them where we are, if we put prices on things and we have the cost on the environment that the company has effectively caused in one financial year, if we have that embedded into the profit and loss, so a type of environmental profit and loss like some companies are doing, then at least it is there for the financial decision makers. And once it is more present in your day-to-day, that's when the narrative shifts in the conversation. So increasingly, the environmental metrics that are partially work in progress, in particular target setting side, they're increasingly being included in the integrated report. So we're moving away from a sustainability report that is a report on the side to the financial report, and companies are reporting to their investor. So the investor can say, oh yeah, you made this much profit, but you have a huge carbon price liability coming up. What are you going to do about that? That's where things start to shift. Again, meeting companies where they are today. Like, I'm not saying let's overhaul this overnight, right? Which would be necessary, but I'm trying to be moderate here, thinking about where they are today and what can work in practice for them. If you keep hammering in that message, it's a cost. And this is the bill that nature would write to us. I always joke with executives. I say to them, look, if the planet could write us a bill, this is what it would be. Carbon, water, deforestation. What are you going to do about it, right? And then it's basically another supplier, and you have to service that demand. So by integrating it, that's where the shift happens. So all the good things we're talking about, really, in a gentle way, force it into corporate mainstream reporting, which is happening slowly but surely.
Thanks, Melanie, and thanks, Rutger. I think this is a good kind of wrap up of our session. The learning is absolutely, learning is clear that yes, we do need a variety of different metrics. They need to be contextualized, yet they need to have validity. And as you said, you know, Melanie, it needs to be written into corporate strategy, and it needs to be written in the statistical offices. And I think what you made so clear is that actually metrics can help us to say what's the bill, you know, that the planet is actually, you know, one should probably actually bring these bills together and document them. That is so absolutely important. So great, fantastic. I hope we can continue this conversation at some other point, and I'm really excited about that. And I would like to thank both of you a lot for being here today and engaging in this conversation across different metrics, you know, kind of company level and more kind of overall. That was fantastic. Yeah, thank you to both of you. And I would like to hand back to my colleague, Elizabeth.
Okay, thank you, Petra. And also from my side, many thanks to both of you, Melanie and Rutger, really for sharing your insights and reflections. I think apart from the many, many details and the inspiring images that you shared, so definitely I'm also going to keep that, you know, the bill that we get handed as humanity, I think, in my mind. I think you really showed us, you know, the really very many ways metrics have power over us and have a power in our lives, in our endeavors that we're doing. So there's a power in what we measure. There's a power in so, you know, do we call it the economy, or do we call it the planet that we're actually living on? It's the question of what kind of power system brought metrics into place, and what are our metrics also keeping up with regard to power systems. And I think the really important, or one really, I think, interesting question for all of us here who are now, I would say, like, yes, aware of the importance and of the power is, of course, now the question, well, how can I shift it? And this is the interesting elements that both of you mentioned, is that tricky question of how do we get from, let's say, a particular reporting or a measurement really into action, and through this action also into new narratives. which I think is both interesting also and important because it connects to the very first session also that we had in our conference series. So the question and the power of narratives, of really showing us a pathway into the future. Because as Rutger rightly said, we want to envision how a future can look like, a different future than, from what I would say many, well, I don't want to say dangerous, but reports that really paint a dire future for us. We want to also imagine a different kind of future, and we want to see how we can get there. So I think with that, this was really extremely illustrative with regarding the power of metrics in all our lives, whether we are actively advocating for others or not. And I think for many of us here also today, who really work in projects or initiatives, who want to bring them also about and make a particular contribution really to transformation for sustainability. For all of us, monitoring systems are really sort of the way to measure our progress. They play a key role from the start of anything that we do. So we often need to develop them right in the beginning, in the planning stage, and they become really intertwined with the whole logic of what we do, how and when, and what value we place on certain activities. So they're really similar to what Rutger and Melanie also explained. They have an extremely implicit and also explicit influence on our initiatives and on our actions. Now, at the same time, the way how we develop monitoring systems and the way we realize them can also have a profound impact on the very collaboration we actually need in order to achieve the progress we want to realize. So it's really a circle. It's a bit of a chicken and egg question. So a lot of times we ask the, of course, really important question on what we should monitor. But at the same time, how we monitor and measure progress is also important. So this includes aspects like when we collect data, whether we have qualitative or quantitative indicators or a mix of both, the intervals in which we check our progress, and also who does it. Like, do we have internal and external perspectives? Is it a team perspective or the analysis of one person who is tasked with it? And how much the monitoring system also supports us then to learn from the results it presents to us and move it into action. Now, this brings us actually to metrics and their learning function, really, whenever we are we're putting forth an endeavor to really change something. So our conversations so far have really highlighted the importance for metrics also for our collective learning. So something that's really, really crucial in the face of the challenges that we simply have ahead of us. We need to envision both where we actually want to go, because our lives are going to change dramatically. But at the same time, we also need to empower ourselves to find pathways of how to get into a different kind of future. So for such learning really to rise, we need to really learn and think. What's the question? Think and learn on our feet, I think. And there's the question, how much can metrics really support us and empower us in this direction? So with the inputs we have just heard, I really want to hear from all of you who are here today on how you would answer the question on how do we best measure progress towards sustainability. And you can find in the chat, you can actually find a link for a Mentimeter presentation, and you will find different options for how to respond to that question. So something that is very inspired by the story that Rutger also shared, the power of the GDP index is that an enormous amount of countries report globally on that one number, basically. So is there really a case for if we should change metrics? Should we have a single index across the world that captures all sustainability aspects? Or to also come back to the details that Melanie shared, when we look at the private sector, should all companies report against the same set of indicators or to different ones? So have a look at the link and look how you agree or disagree with the statements and kind of make your choice. And because we just want to get a feeling of what your experience and what your perspective is really, to also well have a collective reflection and maybe even collective learning moment for all of us here at the conference. Because these statements in the end are also assumptions that really underlie all our conversations around metrics, you know, and reflecting on these assumptions is arguably extremely important for choosing them and for measuring progress, simply because they very profoundly set the direction of where we're going. So the best monitoring system and way to measure progress does not really help us if we think that the way that we apply it is not really helpful for our reflection, learning, and ultimately, of course, adapting our way to track how we get ahead. All right, I'm wondering for my colleague Andy to see if we can have a look what the responses are so far and what all of you are saying, basically. So we have the 3 statements, and I believe the first one is, again, also in the chat. We should have a single index across the world that captures all sustainability aspects. And there we see we have a good 2.6 from, I think, no, it's moving up to 2.8, so solidly in the middle, would say. And second part is actually that we need, or second option is, we need a dashboard of key indicators for sustainability across the world. So there, that's probably the statement that most of you are really strongly, or are mostly agreeing with, from the 3 of them. And I think the third one that we're seeing here is sustainability is qualitative, and we can have quantitative measurements nevertheless. So there are 2.3, 2.2. Yeah, I think we have at least so far for us here a clear pattern that really most of you agree with, saying that all companies should report that, let's say, against the same set of indicators, which I think is an interesting reflection on, again, on the topic of power, really, that is behind metrics. Because I think we had both from Rutger and Melanie a very clear statement, both on the power that is behind a coherence of particular indicator or measurement system that you use. And also, of course, the power that private companies have with regard to really having an impact on how we measure things and how we contribute to sustainable change, simply because the impact that they have on the resources that we have is enormous. All right, so thank you very much for all of you who have given your opinion and your reflection on the chat. That's also going to be captured, so all of us here, you can get these results as one of the results also from the session afterwards. And with that, I would actually like to switch to, let's say, one aspect of monitoring. And I would say one aspect that is arguably incredibly important when it comes to, you know, all of us day-to-day practitioners and really trying to shift things on the ground. So in our sustainability efforts we also need to ask ourselves not only how we measure our progress when you have an initiative, but also what we measure. And I think it's now sort of established practice that we need to dedicate attention to track and monitor activities. We agree on the results, eventually the impact we intend to achieve. However, the progress or the process of how we work together to achieve is kind of the slightly neglected stepchild that often doesn't get so much attention. However, the practice really shows if you track the quality of how you work together with others, it's just as important, because the better we work together, the more effective are also the results we achieve. And at the same time, if we learn from our process of how we work together, that really yields key insights for our future actions. So this can be an important lever to really bridge that gap that we talked about. How do you get from reporting into changing your actions and be also inspired to change your actions and develop a whole different narrative for it? So the monitoring of both progress and process is really key to transformative change endeavors, because they're really essential to help our collective reflection and our shared understanding of where we are and where we need to go. They help us to learn together. They make even better plans for the future, and ultimately also really strengthen a sense of our collective responsibility. So the second question I'd like to ask you to reflect on is, how do we not only measure progress, but also process? And in the spirit of the session, again, you will find a link also in the chat from Andy for a Mentimeter, which this time will not ask you to choose whether you agree or disagree with certain options, but actually simply choose whether you think they apply or not. So it's a multiple choice question. And again, there are a few options for you to choose from, and reflect on which one you think you agree on when it comes to how to combine process monitoring together with progress monitoring. We'll have a look at the results for this a little bit later, so you can also take a moment and simply let that question sink in, and also have a look at the options and let them sink in, because we'll have a look at that a little bit later. All right, with these two, let's say, little pieces of food for thought when it comes to monitoring, I'd really like us to switch and look at some experiences from concrete cases, so our case input givers. And first of all, it gives me really great pleasure to welcome our guests bringing in experience from Morocco. This is Miriam Drissi and Lisa Etzold, who are both from the German Development Corporation working in Morocco in a project to advance youth employment in rural provinces. And on a personal note, I'm particularly happy to have them with us, as I admit I've long admired their diligence and perseverance for often difficult on-the-ground work that you're doing. So their story today will actually illustrate how the ways we monitor our projects is always in interdependence with the quality of collaboration that we have with partners, and therefore really impacts the quality of the impact that we achieve and of the results that we have. So I'd like to hand the microphone over to Miriam and Lisa.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. It's really a pleasure to be with you today, for me and for Lisa, my colleague. First of all, I want to thank you for giving us the opportunity to share our experience from Morocco and our project that is really something we really believe in since we started with the GIZ here in Morocco. Before sharing with you our experience on the metrics aspect, we would like to introduce briefly our project and and the approach of PEJ. Actually, we call it PEJ for French. It's Promotion de l'emploi des jeunes en milieu rural. So it's youth employment in rural area. The objective of our project is the improvement of the employment situation for young women and men in rural areas in a selected region, Fesmknes and Dimler-Knefra. So we have two main regions where we started to implement our project and test it on the floor. Our project is financed by the BMZ, the Corporation Ministry of Germany, in partnership with the Ministry of Labor in Morocco and also with the Employment Agency here in Morocco. So the program started in 2015, and we are supposed to close the project in 2 years approximately. So we especially intervene on the rural areas for youth from these 2 regions, and our approach is based on 3 main aspects or components. First of all, we have our provincial employment committees. Those committees are they regroup actors from local province, local actors in a committee that is dialoguing about the situation of employment and of labor market in the province. So it's like a committee that is always discussing about the needs of the local population and the local market, labor market. Thanks to their analysis and their identification of potential sectors for employment, we can go to our second components, which is trainings and short-term trainings for young people. So we used to develop trainings for 3 weeks to 1 month. These trainings respond to the needs of employment in the local community and for the local market. So we try to help young people to improve their employment situation thanks to vocational qualification and life skills training also. So they are able to join the labor market in their region without going to big cities or having to leave their family in order to find a job. And finally, our third component is the support, the direct support to young people through orientation, information, but also thanks to workshops that are dedicated to like, I don't know, like how to write his resume, his or her motivation letter, how to find a job, how to send their candidature, their sorry, I can't find the word in English. Application. Thank you, Lisa. And all this is to help them find job opportunities in their environment. So this approach were really successful, and we are now reaching the third and second phase of our project, and we are trying to generalize the approach in the entire Morocco with the partnership of the employment agency. Before I give the floor to Lisa, we will introduce you more the aspect of evaluation of our project. We would like to share some numbers and impact of our intervention. So those 6 last years, we reached about 5,000 beneficiaries. Among them, there were about 40% of women, which is really incredible in the rural areas, especially in Morocco. It's very difficult to reach them and to gain the confidence of their parents, of their families, and also of women. In our study, we also measured the satisfaction of the beneficiaries, and we had a very high percentage of satisfaction from young people, and that was very encouraging for us to continue our job and to improve our offer. Also, we had 53% of young people who finally find a job, so they were able to start a new job, and among them there were 54% that were able also to formalize their employment. And in rurality, it's really a very good number for us, because we have a very important number of people working, but in the informal sector. And finally, we had 71% of independent workers who confirmed the improvement of their revenue, and also a lot of them were able to create new jobs. So for indirect impacts for us, new jobs for the community in their community. Now I'm gonna give the floor to Lisa to introduce you our evaluation systems.
Thank you, Miriam. Exactly how Miriam said already, we have a project which is separated into 3 phases, and then currently we're in the 3rd phase already. So we started in 2015 with the implementing and piloting phase. So it was really introducing our approach and developing it together with our partners, and to have everyone on board. It was the first 3 years, so the implementing and piloting phase in 3 provinces in 1 region here in Morocco. So we established it, and we established also our monitoring system, which was at that phase pretty basic, you could say. I mean, we monitored how many beneficiaries did we reach, how many took part, how many could improve their employability, and how many could confirm in the end their employment situation had improved. So really the basics, but because that was just the start of our mission. In the 2nd phase, we could adapt based on these answers on our experiences and on the exchange with the partners. We could adapt the approach and implement it in 6 more provinces. So we extended it, and we could allow ourselves to go into evaluation phase. So really an impact monitoring, where we asked our beneficiaries more questions than just did your situation improve, and our indicators changed on that basis. So now we are really monitoring the impact that we had. For example, in the 3 indicators you see here, you don't have to read it through. I will give you an overview. So this is really the employment situation. Are you in employment 6 months after you participated? Could you improve your employment situation? In that case, it means formalize it, because we discovered that most young people in the rural areas, they're not out of work, they're already working somehow, but in the informal sector with their families, and not really enrolled in good quality, in what we call a good job. So that was an important indicator that we added. And also if they could improve their income after having participated in our services. So now we are in the 3rd phase, and really things are going well in general. So we can allow ourselves to now shift the focus a bit from the beneficiaries, because now this is our partners' work, right? They are now on board, they are behind the approaches. So it's them who are watching the beneficiaries, who are implementing the services. And we are really caring for them being able to do so, and to extend the approaches to more and more provinces all over Morocco. So we are really looking how we can train them, how we can, which human capacity development is necessary, and if we can implement or integrate the approach to national strategies, for example. So that in the end, really our partners are the ones who carry out the approach. Thank you. So all in all, this is I hope you could see this a bit, but our learning process leads to a sustainable approach, to something that is really every phase of we reflect, what have we done, what can we do better, what is the next step to do. So we are monitoring our like Elizabeth said, our process and our progress. So it's a sustainable approach, which is leading to partners who develop an ownership of it, who are capable of implementing it themselves. which is due to a lot of capacity building of all the partners involved, especially the local actors in the provinces, who are in the end those people who should implement it, who should foster the young people in the rural areas. Since we have a holistic approach, we're not only talking directly to the young people in the rural areas, but also to all actors involved in economic development, in youth promotion. We can also improve a little bit the economic situation in the province. We help the actors to get an overview, to get a labor market analysis, to see which sectors could be fostered. So due to this holistic approach, the whole situation, not only of our beneficiaries, but also of their families can improve. So we have these human dimensions that we take into account. And very important is that we're really in constant exchange with the beneficiaries, but also with the career advisors who are working in our career guidance centers, who are in contact with the young people and are in constant exchange how the situation is and what needs they have further on. So we can adapt our approach on that basis. And then, of course, it's really important to adapt everything we do to the rural context, as you see, maybe also our indicators and the way we measure them, because it's really important to take into account that it's really not the same as working in urban areas. Maybe a simple example is the language. Make it accessible for everyone. The way you motivate the young people to come in rural areas is very different than in urban areas. If you talk about digitalization, for example, you have to ask yourself first, are there digital devices? Is there internet? And so on and so on. So I hope you got an overview about our learning approach, and we are open for questions if you have any. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Miriam, both for your input. And I think it was really interesting for both the reasons that you mentioned. It is a learning system that you really have there, and you really integrate the human dimension into it. So it's not a system that exclude that element. So really congratulations to what you did and how it helped you. Now I see there's both a question in the chat and also Rutger, I think, who has a question and who raised his hand. So I'm going to pass the microphone actually to Rutger, if you want to ask your question directly, please.
No, that was actually, I didn't have my hand raised. Sorry, Elizabeth.
Okay.
So that's, well, apart from a compliment for the presentation, but no, sorry about that.
Okay, no worries. Thank you. Then I would go to one of the questions that is in the chat, and it actually goes to you know, in addition to the formalized work with good income that you focused on, are you also, or did you track something like the number of young people who feel fulfilled in their work or feel purposeful in their work? So was this something that you integrated?
Like I don't see the I don't see the chat message, but really feeling fulfilled in their work is the question. Well, we have an impact study, and it's really telephone-based interviews with the questionnaire, but also focus groups. So it's the question is there are many questions also about how is your social situation, are you good with what you're doing, but these are not directly linked to our indicators, so there's not what we report to BMZ. For us, in that case, a job is a job, but yes, of course, we have also what we do in the career guidance centers is really the advice to where do you want to go. And since in the rural areas the private sector is weak very often, we have to encourage people, and we encourage people a lot to become self-employed, to create their own businesses. And so the question there is, what would you want to do? Where would you see yourself? And of course, they also get advice how to develop further, and if they want to pursue studies or trainings, they get the chance to be supported there. But of course, that's very much depending on every individual person, and the possibilities in the rural areas might be limited to that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. I think that's very interesting, you know, with regard to, let's say, at least a measurement that you integrate in your activities, because you say, like, you really focus then on, you know, what kind of career advice the young people are getting, what kind of questions are asked from those seeking employment or seeking to improve their employment, even though that doesn't necessarily go into your formal reporting, but it is, you know, it's something that you take from the system and you integrate it in your future actions. And I think that's also an important distinction to make. Now, maybe one last question that is coming in the chat. There is a question on doing business relates to market. So has there been any partnership in opening markets, which I guess also means emerging markets? That's one of the questions.
Well, we are working on digitalization, for example, as I mentioned as an example. It's difficult in the rural areas, but something that we want to do or would love to do, it depends really on the possibilities, is, for example, to train young people in coding, to have this possibility to access new markets and to have capacities that they wouldn't get just from their school education if they are enrolled in school for long enough. So this is something in this small scale, if you want, where we could act on this. This is something that we're planning on doing, yes. But if someone has any good cooperation ideas, we are always open for this too.
All right, great. Yeah, if there are ideas in there, you hear it, post it in your chat. I would say for now, many thanks to you both, Miriam and Lisa, for sharing your experience and for sharing your reflections. This has really been not only a successful project, but really a successful learning experience. And thank you for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I just want to add some a last conclusion. I want to tell to Elizabeth happy birthday, because it's her birthday today. So I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, and with that, I would say we're not traveling terribly far, because we are traveling to Morocco. No, we're in Morocco and we're traveling to Egypt, sorry. Because I would like to actually give a big welcome to Rania, to Sanya, and also to Nader, who are, again, all from the German Development Corporation, but this time in Egypt. And the three of them have invested enormous energy in shifting a really complex and partly protracted system of stakeholders in Egypt towards lively cooperation, and also to the benefit of the country's youth, this time more specifically for the dual education system, or the dual system for technical education. And their story today will illustrate a bit how metrics can really work as a feedback mechanism that really inspires the continuation and the expansion of a really successful initiative and collaboration. So I'm handing over the microphone to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elizabeth. Also, from my side, yeah, happy birthday. So, yeah, as you already mentioned, Elizabeth, right? What we will be doing today in the next 10 minutes with you is looking at our journey, talking about establishing and maintaining collaboration system inside the vocational and technical education system in Egypt, the so-called Egyptian dual system, and also shedding some light at metrics and how metrics in this regard actually really contributed to improving the overall outcome of the system. So let us dive into the Egyptian context right away. So what can you see here on this picture is students actually of the Egyptian dual system doing some practical training. So the Egyptian dual system is actually a formal apprenticeship program. It takes 3 years, and there are more than 60,000 apprentices enrolled in the Egyptian dual system. And yeah, it is a work-based apprenticeship program, which really means that students are, well, they are spending some times during the week, a couple of days inside schools for theoretical learning. And then the rest of the week, they are going into the company and doing practical training, what you can see here on this picture. And well, the Egyptian dual system, actually, to give you some historical background, was introduced in the 1990s, so already quite some time ago, with support from the German government. And it was and probably still is a response to the high unemployment rate of young people in Egypt on the one hand side, and on the other side, really well, a response to the acute lack of labor, of acute lack of skilled workers. Well, and I'm sure you can imagine, if we are talking about a work-based learning approach, this actually really then asks for collaboration among various stakeholders. Namely, we have the Ministry of Education with its TVET schools. We have the training companies where then practical training takes place. We have the students and the parents, their guardians, and we have service providers who are actually doing some coordination work when it comes to matching students with well, learning outside the schools and then doing the practical training inside the company. So you already see it's quite complex, actually, the entire stakeholder setup. And when our project, the GIZ project, enhancing the Egyptian dual system, started with its work in 2015, when we came in, and by then actually already the Egyptian dual system had been there already for quite some time, we realized actually that a collaboration platform that brings all these stakeholders together was not really functional, or there was not even such a proper comprehensive collaboration platform in place. So the cooperation actually between the different actors that you can see on the slide was really characterized by many disputes, by distrust, by also individuals just focusing on their own benefits and really forgetting about the overarching goal of improving the system. So what became very much clear is that, well, a joint vision, was missing, and a vision that brings together the different stakeholders, setting clear targets and motivating them actually to work together, to work collaboratively towards, and you can see here many aspects, but I'm just going to name a few processes. So it's about, well, ensuring the implementation of new policies and legislations. It is about really ensuring that communication takes place from the government to the national level, but also facilitating monitoring, of course, of processes within the system. And well, one of the first milestones actually of this process of enhancing dialogue capacity was to formulate a shared vision. So of course, this vision was not shared, was not formulated by us, but by the stakeholders of the dual education system in Egypt. And before I hand over to my colleague Anya, I would like to read this vision out to you that was formulated and really guided actually the entire dialogue capacity process. So build and expand a high quality and dynamic dual system through close multi-stakeholder collaboration at all levels that provides attractive, safe, and meaningful training opportunities for a new generation of students, increasing employability and benefiting the Egyptian economy and society. Yeah, and with these words, I would like to hand over to you, Rania.
Okay, thank you, dear Sanya. Building on what already Sanya explained, that towards achieving all this mission vision for dual education system and get all the partners around one table. So we started different phases and different phases to introduce, first of all, the concept of the dialogue concept to our partners and how to get them all around one table and have a meaningful dialogue. Then after have this phase and introducing the concept of dialogue, we created this platforms for tech, or that now we name it technical amanas. It's a dialogue platform, gather all the stakeholders of dual education system to get together, have this meaningful discussions, steer together the process of dual education system. And we started actually to have this governorate or regional steering dialogue platform, first in 9 governorates, and plus we already created a central one just to support the governorates communication among between the national level and the governorate level. Then after having this or creating the governorate technical amanas or equals dialogue platforms for dual education system, we started to bring them new ideas or how to materialize more their topics in a very meaningful way. So we in the project we started with them to how to formulate ideas and how to formulate a proposal and how to formulate their discussion to get it more into a policy proposal. Then we have first, we conducted the first ever policy summit for dual education system, and we have in this time around 24 proposal, and we discuss it, and then we'll further it to be 10 policies, and then we come up with 4 meaningful policy recommendation to be discussed with the high level or the central partners. Then after all of this phases of first introducing dialogue, then having this governorate technical amanas and have this discussion to a meaningful policy proposals, we started towards how to implement the formalization for this governorate and center technical amana, or again equals to the dialogue platforms. Please, Sanya, the next one. So after this, after introducing the dialogue and creating the dialogue platforms with our partners, we have this 3 levels of platforms. As you already see, in the bottom we have the governorates, which is in different governorates in Egypt. Now we have more than 9 months. And in the middle, we have central technical amana, which is the body to coordinate and communicate or manage the communication between the governorate technical amanas and the EC, which is on the top, the executive council, which is headed by the deputy minister, and it is the body responsible for approve or decision making for dual education system in Egypt. So in the background of this slide, you can see different, or at least an example for meetings for governorate technical amanas from different governorate meeting regularly to discuss and come up with solutions and check the challenges to communicate it to the central technical amana and for sure the executive council. So to maintain this communication among all these stakeholders, we have this technical amanas hub every month. We meet together to discuss whatever related topics to the dual education system, plus creating the newsletter for the technical amanas to exchange the solutions and exchange achievements to encourage everyone to learn from the others. Plus, actually, we have, together with the partners, one of the phases for the training with CLI, we created a replication plan. How to replicate this idea and this concept and initiative of technical amanas to be replicated over all Egypt. And actually, during even this initiative itself, the people were very, very encouraged to replicate this idea, as they appreciated the idea of cooperation and how they can get all of them around one table and discuss what is relevant to their operations and have meaningful directions. Then, before handing to my colleague Nader, I want to say that looking forward, we wanted to just move from this dialogue platform to shift and have it to the next level, to be a steering committees and steering platforms. To you, Nader.
Thank you very much, Rania. And if we talk really about metrics, and I take Dr. Kuenkel's words at the beginning, and the following discussions, whether we should look at the metrics in terms of the qualitative aspect or the quantitative aspects. It's very easy to look at numbers. For example, as you see in front of us on the right side of the slide, that we have so far conducted, or the partners so far conducted 165 technical amana or dialogue meetings in the 9 governorates that we supported. So that's a huge number within the frame of 2 or 3 years. However, if we look at the qualitative side of it, we see that there is a positive jealousy between the different technical amanas or the different locations. Now, when a governorate that hears about the concept that we developed and how the collaboration between the different stakeholders is enhancing the implementation of the dual system, and the problems are being addressed and solved and documented even, you can really tell that this qualitative aspect is more important and is more encouraging people to replicate this model. Also, the acceptance of this whole idea, and that it should be formalized and it should be put in official decrees issued by the ministry. That's also, we could easily say that it's a paper and it's done, but behind that, the acceptance and buy-in from the stakeholders was much more required. And linking this to that, also how the mechanisms between the different amanas on the ground level and also with the top level is enhanced, and whether by virtual meetings or by physical visits to the different governorates, exchanging information, that was also a qualitative aspect if we look at it that way. In terms of the so far where we are and what has been achieved through such dialogue platforms, last year there was a ministerial decree issued which governs the relationships, the roles and responsibilities of between all the stakeholders of the system. And a round of policy seminars were conducted in the different governorates, gathering all governorates of Egypt, and not only those 9 governorates that we provided, to give them an orientation about the new governance structure and also about the technical amanas concept. And also in terms of metrics, if we link this to that, the introduction of the new governance structure, which by the way included the criteria and standards of the companies to join the system. Once we put that on paper, the number of training opportunities affected was affected by those criteria. So it might not seem like a good thing from the outside, but from the inside, this means that we are moving in the right direction to ensure the quality of the system by ensuring the right companies are joining the system. Moving on, and hopefully this is where I would leave you with this note, that establishing dialogue and ensuring the different stakeholders talk and sit on one table and challenge each other and come with joint decisions is a very important thing, and a very important effort that was expensed over the last years. Moving on now, we are changing, not changing, but we are imposing to them that we measure the success, and we measure the success of the technical amanas and of the dialogue by introducing metrics, by introducing performance metrics, how to transform the vision and mission, which my colleague Sanya talked about earlier, to performance indicators, to a workable action plan that is identified by roles and responsibilities between the different stakeholders, and then we come at the end of each cycle to measure our performance on the ground level and on the overall level of the system in Egypt. Thank you very much, and we are more than willing to answer any of your questions or queries.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, to all three of you, I think it was a great reminder for all of us, really, what the quality of really, or the impact that good quality meetings in sort of a structured process can really have, not only on the initiative and the efforts to bring stakeholders together, but really to develop a measurement system that then allows you really a pathway into the future, you know, like upscale things and develop things further, and bring an own dynamic into the system, so that you are not the drivers, but you can take a backseat then. So thank you very much. And I'm looking at the chat for questions that have come up to you or for you. And there is the question, in your experience, what were the key factors that really led to success in the Egyptian dual system and setting it up? Who wants to take it?
Okay, I can go for it. I guess if we look at the dual system in Egypt, and I recall one very important study that was made in 2010, if I remember well, about the dual system after the German development cooperation has left it, and has left the support, I mean, to the Egyptian government and the Egyptian stakeholders. The study talked about how sustainable was the model, even without any external support from a donor or a development cooperation like the GTZ back in the time. And simply the reason for that was that all stakeholders had the interest to sustain the model. The students were happy to be engaged in the model because, first of all, it gives them a future. It qualifies them in a different way than the normal technical education in Egypt. The ministry or the state was also happy because it was fulfilling their mission statement to provide qualified technicians to the market, to the labor market. And the companies or the labor market itself was satisfied because they were able to source quality graduates and quality labor to join their workforce. So at the end of the day, the underlying effect is that all the stakeholders are happy and satisfied with the output, which, in my point of view, makes the dual system sustainable and relevant for all stakeholders.
Okay, thank you, Nede. I think that is actually also a good reminder for all of us on the importance of really quality structures that keep stakeholders engaged and motivated, and let them see also the added value of the collaboration that that they're invested in. And I guess that that relates actually to the other question that we also have in the chat. You know, you explained quite in detail how that great dynamic, once you set it up, is really paramount to the continuation, also to developing your metric system that allows you to go in the future. But the question goes to basically, how did you set it up? How did you even like get to that point where the dynamic was so well? So when you set up the dialogue platform between the different cities or areas, how did you really sort of get that initial motivation to the stakeholders to participate?
Rania, maybe this one, I think you would be the best to answer that.
Thank you, Nader. Actually, we don't establish the governorate technical amanas among the cities. Each governorate has its own technical amana, its independent technical amana. However, we encouraged, and they are very motivated towards exchanging the experience among them. So we introduced the idea of technical amanas hub. This is the first idea, just to get them, all of them, on online platform and exchange all their ideas and challenges and proposals for their education system. And from our side as GIZ, we providing expertise to introduce some new ideas and concepts, plus introduce or producing this newsletter for technical amanas to encourage all of them to have a look what has been done from their sides and what are the challenges and its solutions if there, and etc. So yes, it's very a key to enhance this communication among the stakeholders on governorate level, as well as having the central technical amana to attend the governorate's meetings regularly. It's very important, and we from our side, yes, definitely we encourage this. However, sometimes we find their initiative to meet with the governorate technical amana and discuss with them what's popped up on their agenda and how to find solution, or at least how to voice their needs to the executive council to formulate it as a policy. So yes, it's a key for their work to communicate, and this is something we building on as well. For example, to replicate the technical amanas overall Egypt. And this was very surprisingly for us, actually, through this rounds of policy evaluation that Nader already presented, that the people were very encouraged after introducing this model of technical amana. After this, we found at least 5 governorate established their own technical amana, and actually for us at the project, we were surprised. Okay, it's very impressive, and it seems the idea is working. So this for us give us a very healthy sign that we have to continue and roll out overall Egypt. And I believe, Nader, you can talk more here about shifting from only to expand in another 6 governorate to overall Egypt, and this is one of the signs for us. Thank you. Hope this meets your answers. Your question, sorry.
Okay, thank you, Rania. Thank you for that answer. And I would say with a look to the time, I would leave it at that. Thank you very much for your input and for sharing your experience. There are, I think, 1 or 2 other questions in the chat. If you feel you have the time, it would be great if you can answer them in writing. And yeah, otherwise, I would actually, with these, experiences and stories fresh in our mind, I would actually have a look now, at the results from the second Mentimeter question that we had today, and namely that big question, which I think was also again in the chat, on how do you not only measure progress but also process. So and there were different options that you could choose from, so such as regularly reflect on and adjust basically your whole progress measurements, so how, what, and when, kind of in the core team, so have like a whole system for that in place. Similar to that also, to the measurement system that you already have, sort of add a collaboration process monitoring tool on top of it, and basically put it on the same level as, say, results monitoring and activity monitoring. And there were also the options of developing measurements for transparency and diversity in the progress indicators, which I believe, just from the conversations before, were also really important elements that many of you mentioned. Or even redesign the whole monitoring reviews as collective learning sessions. And as we can see from the graphic that Andy is sharing, it's actually a clear, a relatively clear sign that definitely the element of let's switch from monitoring reviews and evaluation sessions and really conception more in the culture of a collective learning session. And I think that's an important insight just from all of us, from our experience and expertise here in the room, to that our feeling here for the moment is really to say, if we want metrics to really be empowering for us, and therefore have a look at the process quality and see how that helps us to even be better in the way that we work together and achieve our goals, then we really need to get away from a monitoring culture, which, well, I guess sometimes can also have aspects of control connected to it, to really see it more as a learning culture. So that's one result, and let's say a cluster of the pattern that is here. And I think the other one that was there was also the first question that most of you also very strongly agreed with. So regularly reflect on and review the entire system in a team. And I think that speaks very much to the experience that we heard both from Morocco, but also from Egypt, that really things get the whole system with how you track on what you measure, where you want to go, and how you get there, to really include that and integrate that in the process as you go along, in order to not miss opportunities, but also not miss warning signals. All right, and I would say with that, that gives me actually, I would say, an interesting transition point really to sort of the last remarks that we have for the session, is that there is also, when we again think about more broadly about the whole topic of transformation literacy, some of you might already know there is this, there's a book from CLI that is freely available that's called Leading Transformative Change Collectively. And it actually has a whole chapter dedicated to both a process monitoring tool, but also to how to use it to setting up monitoring really as a collective learning culture. So I think it's quite interesting that it really ties on with, you know, the, let's say, the interest or the focus also that quite some of you here have. So just as a point of interest, if you want to read that up, that is there. And similarly, we also have the a process monitoring tool available on our website, and also on our Compass tool app, that may to at least to some degree inspire you with regard to integrating that in your in reviews and in sessions regarding the metrics and the measurement systems that you need. Now with that, we really, I would say, had a really comprehensive and very, diverse journey into many topics regarding, I would simply say, the power of metrics, but also the empowering role that metrics can really play for all of us engaged in advancing sustainability efforts, and to really use that word, as Rutger also said, like become literate in transformation. And next session, next week, same time, same place, pretty much, we will have a look at the role of governance in transformation literacy efforts. So governance with the meaning of how do we get very different interests, very different positions and perspectives really together around one table, as Rania said, and as they also experienced, and in a structure that really integrates these perspectives in a quality way, so that the added value for engaging into transformative change is is always there and is always clear and present and engaging to all participants and to all stakeholders, basically, so that the engagement really stays there and the impact can also achieve. And for this session, we will again have a quite diverse number of inputs. We'll have a global look and really look at the role of government when it comes to, I would say, an extremely timely question of governance, namely those of migration, so global migration governance, and what we can learn from those experiences. So with a very, I would say, hot topic that brings a lot of people into very strong opinions. How can you set up good governance structures that nevertheless bring people around one table and help them collaborate together? We'll also have a look, I would say, even more importantly, at the times that we are living right now, is the role of civil society as checks and balances for existing governance structures, especially in, let's say, areas where civil society is historically not so strong or simply does not have the opportunities that they have in other places in the world. And we will actually look at an example from the EU-Russia Civil Society Forum, which I think is most timely and most important for what we're living now. And finally, we will also have a look at the key lessons and really, really meaningful, I think, insights that we can take away from governance and community development in South Africa. So going to a completely different place and really looking what role community development and governance really had in interplaying together. So with that, I would like to bring the session to a close. I thank again really all the contributors who have been here and all our input givers. So in particular, Melanie and Rutger and Miriam, Lisa, Anya, Nada, Sanya, all of you have been here for really sharing your experiences and simply, I hope, also giving us inspiration, certainly giving me inspiration, and also simply hints and hopes for really changing things for the future. And remember that the way that we look at things and we also measure how we go ahead and advance is really powerful, not only for us, but also for all of the others that we work with. And I think more now than ever, we really need empowering metrics that make us see a sustainable future and pathways into the future. And I think the clear message from today was they are always there. It is a question for us giving them focus and giving them attention. And then they also allow us to see these different pathways and to develop these narratives together. So thank you very much to all of you and hope to see you next week.